线长山又高，处处港口都险要。
Hello and welcome to STXY, where we dive deep into the Taiwan Strait and talk about Taiwan, mainland China, cross-strait relations, and beyond, sharing perspectives not typically covered by Western mainstream media. Today we're going to do another current event episode that's pretty related to the last one about the DPP support for Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law. And after some thinking, I truly think Lai Ching-te is the stupidest leader Taiwan has ever had, KMT or DPP. Lai Ching-te's predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, had friends in the KMT and understood the delicate nature of Taiwan's politics and the importance of maintaining a certain balance between the blue and green camps, the blue camp being the KMT and its allies, and the green camp being the DPP and its allies. After all, Tsai Ing-wen began her political career as a bureaucrat when the KMT was in charge and was basically Li Denghui's protege before joining the DPP in 2004, after Li Denghui was succeeded by the first leader of Taiwan from the Democratic Progressive Party, Chen Shui-bian. Chen Shui-bian was the mayor of Taipei City for a single term before he ran for so-called president of the so-called Republic of China back in 2000. And as the first leader from the DPP, marking the first transfer of power in Taiwan from the KMT, he understood the need to be cooperative, especially when the DPP was in the minority of the legislature. The DPP today, under Lai Ching-te, though, seems to believe that because the DPP controls the executive body of the government, that any challenge to the DPP is therefore undemocratic, despite the fact that the DPP only has 51 out of 113 seats in the legislature. Now, the KMT on its own does not have the majority, with only 52 of the 113 seats, but right now the third party, called the TPP or the Taiwan People's Party, has 8 seats in the legislature and is basically in a quasi-united front with the KMT in their opposition against the DPP, along with 2 independent legislators. If we count them all as one unit, then they are 62 out of 113 against the DPP's 51 out of 113. This puts the TPP in a pretty powerful position despite only having 8 seats, because assuming the DPP and KMT vote in opposite ways 100% of the time, and a majority needs to be reached, then the TPP plays the role of a tiebreaker. And the DPP hates this because it shows the kind of influence third parties can potentially have in a liberal democracy, which is why the DPP, while accusing the KMT and TPP of being anti-democratic, is also launching an attack campaign on Ko Wen-je, the TPP candidate for leadership in the 2024 election, and the founder and former chairman of the TPP, until he resigned from his position as chairman recently due to the fact that he's under investigation for corruption right now, which I will talk about in a later episode. Long story short, it's a political witch hunt intended to bury the TPP. The speaker of the legislature is the KMT's Han Kuo-yu, and he was able to win because the speaker is voted for by all legislators, and the TPP abstained from voting in the second round, while the 2 independents voted for him, making the vote 54 to 51. All the way back then, so back in 2024, when the new administration came in and the new legislature was elected, supporters of the DPP were accusing the TPP of being anti-democratic because they did not vote the way DPP supporters wanted them to. So nowadays, the DPP's attitude, as you can see, is either you're with us or you're a communist fifth column. And now the DPP is accusing the KMT and TPP of forcibly imposing their will through undemocratic means, despite the KMT and TPP together having the majority, because the 2 parties voted together to amend 3 laws, which are the Public Officials Election and Recall Act, the Constitutional Court Procedure Act, and the Act governing the allocation of government revenues and expenditures. Let's take a listen to what Acting Director of the DPP's Department of International Affairs, Chen Wen-hao, also known as Michael Chen, has to say about this. If you're watching this on YouTube, then you'll see what an ugly-ass malformoid he is.
The KMT is steering Taiwan back towards authoritarianism by silencing discussion within the legislature and seeking to forcibly pass laws undermining our democratic institutions. KMT's actions show a blatant disregard for legislative due process, and make no mistake, they are a direct assault on our democracy. On Monday, KMT legislators barricaded themselves in the Internal Administration Committee in the Legislative Yuan, literally taping the doors and using violence to physically block DPP legislators from entering. In an unprecedented and undemocratic move, KMT legislators rushed through amendments to the Public Officials Election and Recall Act without the presence of DPP members. By blatantly disregarding democratic norms, the KMT has infringed on the public's constitutional rights and eroded Taiwan's democracy. This is not the first time KMT has rammed through legislation without the participation or input of the general public. This May, after KMT caucus convener Fu Kunxi returned from China, KMT forcibly passed legislation on an unlawful expansion of parliamentary power that was later ruled unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court. At least then, DPP legislators were allowed in the meeting room. Last week, following Fu's return from Hong Kong, the KMT escalated its actions by seeking to ram through 3 bills that would further paralyze Taiwan's democratic institutions. 2 of these bills would strip away the last resorts to countering KMT's destruction of our institutions. One, the Election and Recall Act amendment, will make it nearly impossible to recall legislators, while another would paralyze the Constitutional Court, rendering it unable to rule as unconstitutional any future bills passed by the KMT. DPP legislators have employed every available measure to block bills from being passed through such undemocratic means. We will continue to stand up and take action in the face of destruction and breakdown of Taiwanese democracy. This is a pivotal moment for Taiwan's democracy. As KMT continues to undermine the Constitution and create political chaos, the DPP remains steadfast in defending our constitutional norms and democratic institutions. Faced with KMT's stubbornness on these laws, which is in line with their obsessive rejection of Taiwan's indigenous summary program, and their determination to impose ever more laws to paralyze the government, a question comes to mind, ultimately the only one that matters. For whom and for whose interests are they really working?
So basically he's saying these amendments will make it impossible to recall public officials, paralyze the Constitutional Court, and he's implying that the KMT is doing this to serve the interests of the Communist Party of China. But today I will get into how in the past it was the DPP that pushed for more or less the same reforms. Now let's take a quick look at what the DPP tweeted from its official Twitter account. The KMT and TPP forced through a trio of political chaos laws with no regard for legislative due process. They violently assaulted DPP legislators and forcibly imposed their will through undemocratic means. The DPP condemns their utter disdain for Taiwanese democracy. By ignoring parliamentary procedures and tarnishing the legislature's dignity, the KMT and TPP have caused immense harm to our democracy. The DPP calls on all citizens to stand against their reckless actions and protect Taiwan's democratic values. Yeah, I thought in electoral politics, if you're in the minority, you just take it and work for a better election so you can pass new laws and get the policies you want. But according to the DPP, this is undemocratic. What this tweet, as well as that malformoid Chen Wenhao, failed to mention is how it was the DPP legislators who began the violence the night of the 19th when they smashed 3 windows, broke into the legislature, and occupied the speaker's chair. Now, as for the KMT barricading itself and preventing the DPP from entering and discussing the amendments on the 16th of December, well, what can I say? The DPP has resorted to those tactics in the past while it was the majority in legislature. And while I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do, it goes to show how divided the parties are and that the only way to really pass any bills is to just have the majority. What did the leader of the Taiwan area, Lai Ching-te, have to say about this? On Facebook, he basically said that amendments to these 3 laws were passed without sufficient discussion or proper procedures, So he's basically talking about how the KMT barricaded themselves into a meeting room to prevent the DPP from going in. But if you watch the video, it's kind of apparent that the DPP would have just gone in and sabotaged the whole thing, and they weren't there to have a good faith discussion. That's just kind of how the legislature works. The KMT's kind of been in that position in the past as well when, Taiwan's liberal democracy is kind of where, people used to say, oh, we're a young democracy, so we're not as civilized as Americans or whatever. No, I think this is the logical conclusion of liberalism in psychosis. And liberalism necessarily ends in psychosis when you have all of these contradictions inherent to neoliberalism and all that. Anyways, Lai Ching-te talked about how these amendments to the Election and Recall Act, the Constitutional Court Procedure Act, and the Revenue and Expenditures Act undermine democratic principles, judicial independence, and resource allocation fairness. And then he complained about the implementation of a majority rules principle in the Constitutional Court being an unreasonable barrier for the court. And then he complained about changes in the Revenues and Expenditures Act jeopardizing critical programs like childcare subsidies, education, infrastructure, as well as defense. And then he commended DPP supporters for apparently standing up for democracy when they were in fact sent by him to cheerlead the obstruction of legislation by democratically elected legislators. Okay, so these amendments were fast-tracked, and the opposition is the majority in the legislature. How is further discussion going to stop the amendments from passing? He wants more minority party input? Well, the TPP, which has 8 seats in parliament and is part of the opposition, is the minority party in the legislature. The DPP is in the minority, but only barely, with 51 out of 113 seats. So it's close to 50%. And all it really needs to do is sway the TPP away from the KMT and towards itself if it wants to win votes. It doesn't even have to wait until the next election. But instead of trying for better elections or winning over the TPP, it's just trying to mobilize the people against the legislature by accusing the opposition of being anti-democratic or being fifth columns. But the problem is Lai Ching-te won the election with just 40% of the vote, and if we account for abstentions, less than 30% of the vote. He doesn't have the sway needed to mobilize enough people to make a difference. And the DPP accusing the KMT and TPP of ignoring democratic processes and being violent is hilarious because while brawling did end up happening on the 20th, it only began because DPP members broke windows of the legislature and entered the building on the night of December 19th, right before the morning session on the 20th, in order to occupy the legislative chamber and disrupt the hearing. And this was basically done under the directive of Lai Ching-te, who, like I said, also mobilized DPP supporters to surround the legislature that night. But he did make sure that they did not storm in and occupy the legislature because he knew that doing so would have been a PR disaster for the DPP given how unpopular they are at this moment. So is the DPP making a big deal out of all of this because the amendments to these 3 bills are really that big of a deal? Or is it because of something else? I think they truly are strongly opposed to the proposed amendments to the 3 bills, but those amendments can always be undone in the future. The bigger reason for the DPP starting drama over this, I think, is that the passage of these bills sets a precedence of the KMT and TPP working together in opposition to the DPP. And this would be the first time that there's a third party that doesn't have roots in either of the 2 major parties. Nor was it born from a color revolution like the new Power Party. A third party having enough sway to cause issues for the DPP while not truly being aligned with the KMT poses a big threat to the DPP's grip on power because by now the DPP is great at winning elections against the KMT at the central level, but it's screwed if the TPP decides to really form a united front with the KMT against the DPP. I also think the DPP under Lai is acting so brashly because Lai Ching-te does not have experience running a government with a formidable opposition. Before he became the so-called premier in 2017 and later the so-called vice president in 2020, Lai Ching-te's biggest post in government was mayor of Tainan City from late 2010 to mid-2017. He won that post in 2010 with 60% of the vote, and this isn't to mention, Tainan City has never had a KMT mayor since 1997, and the city council has always been majority DPP. So Lai Ching-te faced no meaningful opposition whatsoever. Then in 2017, he became the so-called premier of the so-called Republic of China, meaning his job was basically to manage the executive branch of the government under the scrutiny of the so-called president, which at the time was Tsai Ing-wen. So he didn't call the shots in government at the time. And then from 2020 to 2024, he was the so-called vice president for Tsai Ing-wen, meaning once again, he answered to Tsai Ing-wen and did not call the shots. Even if he did call the shots, from 2020 to 2024, during the time when he served as so-called vice president, the DPP had 60% of the legislative yuan. In fact, throughout all of Tsai Ing-wen's leadership, the DPP had the majority of the legislature. So the executive body did not have to contend with the legislature dominated by the opposition. But come 2024, we're now in a situation, like I said, where Lai Ching-te won the election with the most votes out of all three candidates, but not a majority of the votes. And the legislature is controlled by the opposition, meaning that for the first time since 2008, the DPP is incumbent while the opposition has the majority of the legislature. When Chen Shui-bian was leader from 2000 to 2008, the legislature was dominated by the opposition. And back when Chen Shui-bian was leader, it was the first time the DPP won leadership. And it won in 2000 with less than 40% of the vote. So with most of society and the legislature against the DPP, Chen Shui-bian knew that he had to work and compromise with the Pan-Blue coalition in order to get anything done. And that using the anti-democratic tactics that Lai Ching-te is employing now would have damaged the image of his party, which was incumbent for the very first time. First impressions matter. Then from 2008 to 2016, Taiwan's leadership position went back to the KMT for 8 years with Ma Ying-jeou's election. And for both of his terms, the legislature was majority KMT. 2016 was a huge turning point in Taiwan because it was the first time the DPP held both the leadership as well as the legislature with a majority, making the DPP more powerful than it had ever been in the past. In 2016, support for the DPP was high in large part due to the Sunflower Movement in 2014, which successfully painted the KMT as a puppet of the Communist Party of China. But then support for the DPP dwindled, and Tsai Ing-wen was projected to lose re-election in 2020 against the KMT's Han Kuo-yu, who had shot up to superstardom in 2018 and 2019. But then the Hong Kong riots happened, and the DPP used the one-sided reporting of the issue in Taiwan's media to fearmonger voters into believing that if the DPP loses, Taiwan will become the next Hong Kong and suffer under the big bad Communist Party of China. But from 2020 to 2024, the Tsai administration did not really improve the lives of the people in Taiwan, and support for the DPP plummeted as more and more people became worried about issues like rising housing prices, inflation, widening wealth inequality. And people were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with what they perceived to be the government's overreach, being too controlling over local city and county governments. And while this was happening, there was a series of high-profile cases of corruption involving DPP officials and their associates, which really damaged the party's image. And so the DPP is now governing without the support of the majority of the people on Taiwan and against an opposition-dominated legislature. In 2024, there were talks between the KMT and TPP to join forces and run on the same ticket. And had that happened, they would have very likely won the election. But that's not how things played out, which is how Lai Ching-te won with 40% of the vote. But now Lai Ching-te and the DPP are very focused on winning re-election in 2028, as well as winning back the legislature. You think the way to do that would be to compromise with the opposition in the legislature while you're in the minority and act in a way that shows you respect the will of the people, winning their trust and their votes in 2028 to secure your re-election and regain the majority in the legislature, right? But no, instead of doing that, they're going on an all-out campaign to paint the TPP and KMT as CPC puppets while trying to bury the TPP with that political witch hunt against Ko-Wen-je on flimsy corruption charges. And the DPPs adopted this mentality that's like, if we cannot win local elections, then we'll just initiate recalls. Because as the law currently stands, in order to initiate a recall for a mayor, a petition must be signed by at least 10% of eligible voters in the city. Once the recall is initiated, just 25 of all eligible voters in the city must vote in favor of the recall. And if the number of votes in favor for the recall outnumber the votes against, then the recall was successful. So think about it. In theory, only 25% of a mayor's constituents have to vote for a recall to get rid of a mayor. This system is easily abused. And this is related to the recent passing of amendments to those 3 laws that the DPP whined about being anti-democratic, because one of these laws was the Public Officials Election and Recall Act. And these amendments were proposed by the KMT and backed by the TPP. So the proposed revision requires people who initiate and sign recall petitions to provide photocopies of their ID cards when submitting their signatures in order to prevent petition fraud. Whereas right now, campaigners are only required to present ID numbers and registered addresses of endorsers, which has potential for fraud. It also requires a number of votes in favor of recall to exceed the number of votes the official originally received when he was elected, which is, again, to prevent abuse of the system. So let's say a mayor won the election of a city with, 50,000 votes. In order to have him recalled, you need 50,000 plus 1 votes. So before the revisions, the way things currently work is the DPP can lose a mayoral election, then get 10% of the eligible voters to sign a petition for a recall. Then they get 25% of voters to vote in favor of the recall. And then it can remove a KMT or TPP mayor that it doesn't like. You can agree or disagree with this bill, but what you can't disagree with is the fact that the legislators were elected by the people, and they voted in favor of these revisions, which means there's nothing undemocratic about these amendments passing. And it's very funny how the DPP is accusing the pushing of this bill by the majority of the legislature to be undemocratic when they were the ones who stormed the chamber in an attempt to block the review session and started fistfights to prevent the amendments from passing. To begin with, like I said, when you're in the minority in legislature and you're outvoted, all you can do is take it. This isn't the majority of the people on the island upset about the decision and taking matters into their own hands. It's a minority of legislators creating an obstruction for the majority of the elected legislators. So how can you say with a straight face that it's the KMT and TPP that are behaving undemocratically right now? Now, what are the amendments to the 2 other bills that the DPP is so butthurt about? I'm going to quickly introduce how the Constitutional Court here in Taiwan works. And the most direct comparison I'll make is with the U.S. Supreme Court. So the way the U.S. Supreme Court works, as you probably know, is there is a total of 9 justices and that a quorum of 6 justices must be present to decide on a case. And there must be a majority in agreement to establish legal precedents for future cases, meaning 5 justices have to agree on something for the decision to count. So there is a majority rules principle in the U.S. because for anything to pass, you need 5 out of 9 justices, and there needs to be a quorum of 6. However, the way things currently work in Taiwan is, so the Constitution requires there to be 15 grand justices in the Constitutional Court, and there must be a quorum of 9 justices for a case to be decided, and 6 justices have to be in agreement for a decision to pass. Now, this is a problem because there are 15 justices, but only 6 of them need to agree, meaning there can be situations where the minority rules. And in October of last year, so 2024, 7 out of the 15 grand justices retired. Under the law here, the so-called president, so right now Xiangyu, has to nominate new justices to replace the ones that retired. And then those nominees are either approved or rejected by the legislature. Now, this is a problem because with 7 justices retired, all Xiangyu has to do to control the judiciary is make sure all 7 of his nominees are loyal to him. And even though 7 is less than half of the 15, it's over the threshold of 6 justices in agreement to make a decision. And therefore, the legislature, dominated by the opposition, rejected Lai's picks, meaning the Constitutional Court can't function right now because there's only 8 remaining justices and there needs to be a quorum of 9 of them to be present for sessions to be held. So in order to mitigate the risk of Lai Ching-te single-handedly controlling the judiciary, the KMT and TPP have proposed amendments to the Constitutional Court Procedure Act so that decisions made by Lai's picks are made with a broader consensus among the remaining 8 justices. To do this, they propose increasing the quorum to 10, which is 2/3 of 15, and requiring 9 justices to be in agreement for any decision to pass. This would make it a bit similar to the US, which requires a quorum of 6 out of 9, which is 2/3. So, 10 out of 15 is also 2/3. And in the US, it requires 5 to be in agreement for the Supreme Court to make a ruling. 5 out of 9 in the case of the US is roughly 55%. And in Taiwan, under the new rules, 9 out of 15 is 60%. This would prevent a minority of the Constitutional Court from making rulings against the majority. Most constitutional or Supreme Courts in the world operate under a majority rules principle. So these amendments are aimed at bringing that principle to Taiwan's judiciary review process and prevent politically motivated lawsuits from being the norm in the Constitutional Court. Of course, the DPP is calling this undemocratic and saying that these high thresholds make it difficult for the judiciary to act as a check on executive or legislative overreach, and that the legislature is simply trying to make it easier to pass controversial laws that may be in violation of the Constitution. Again, in a normal liberal democracy, if the DPP takes issue with these amendments, then it should just work harder to win more seats in the legislature and pass amendments that align with its own interests. But instead of doing that, they're just, doing what they're doing right now, saying that the oppositions are a bunch of pinko commies. What's funny about the DPP calling this anti-democratic now is back when the KMT's Ma Ying-jeou was leader and the DPP was in the minority of the legislature, it was none other than the DPP that wanted these sorts of reforms to raise the threshold for decisions. But then Tsai Ing-wen won leadership in 2016 and the DPP got the majority of the legislature. So there was no longer much of an incentive for them to overhaul the judiciary since they now had the power to influence judicial appointments and shape the legal landscape through their own policies. But now the DPP is calling the opposition undemocratic for trying to toughen the process of judicial review. But this is what the DPP wanted back when the KMT was incumbent. So at this point, it's quite obvious that democracy to the DPP means nothing more than acting in the interests of the Democratic Progressive Party, and that if you're against the Democratic Progressive Party, you're against democracy because you're against the party that calls itself democratic. It's kind of like how radical liberals in America have said things like how if you're against or have any criticisms of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's because you think Black lives don't matter because that's in the name. And now we'll take a look at the third bill that's being amended, which is the Act governing the allocation of government revenues and expenditures, which is the law that governs how resources are allocated between the so-called central government and local governments. As things currently stand, the central government gets 75% of revenues while local governments get 25%. But now it's going back to 60% going to central and 40% going to local, which is how things used to be before 1999. The reasoning for this is with the central government getting 75% and local governments getting 25%, local governments have a hard time dealing with financial challenges while allocating more resources to local governments promotes independent regional development with solutions tailored to the needs of a particular city or county with less micromanagement from the central government. Once again, you know what's funny? Back when Li Denghui, who was the chairman of the KMT as well as the leader of the Taiwan area, changed the allocation from 60-40 to 75-25, you know who was against the change and wanted to keep it at 60-40? It was the DPP, because the DPP had not yet become incumbent in the central government, but was the incumbent party in most local governments. So, of course they wanted more resources. But now the situation is reversed. The DPP controls only 5 out of 22 local governments, but it controls the central government. So now it has a different position on this issue. And they're spreading a fear campaign saying that, the defense budget will be cut, which is unfounded because major defense programs like big procurements are normally done through special budgets. And to be honest, those are a huge waste of taxpayer money to begin with, since we're essentially being strong-armed into buying outdated and ineffective weapons from the US at jacked-up prices. Of course, now, some in the DPP are also fear-mongering about the amendments eating away from social programs like retirement funds or health insurance. But the central government consistently manages to get tax surpluses every year, enough to absorb these changes without reducing benefits for the people. So while the DPP's concerns about fiscal stability are valid in theory and in principle, in actuality, they really just want to maintain centralized control over resources rather than allow opposition-dominated cities and counties to gain more resources. I don't really have many opinions about this particular bill, but my stance remains the same. If this is a bad bill in the DPP's eyes, then change it back to 75-25 once you get the majority in the legislature. But, the common theme of this episode, instead of doing that, they're just calling the KMT and TPP undemocratic for proposing amendments. But instead of doing that, of course, they're just calling the KMT and TPP undemocratic, spreading fear campaigns of these two parties being in cahoots with the communists, and starting fistfights in the legislature. So, what do you guys think of these recent events? It'd be interesting to hear what you guys say in the comments below. And if you have any questions about what was covered today, feel free to ask them in the comments. I've been just a little bit vocal in the replies to the DPP's posts on Twitter lately, and I just found out the other day that they've decided to block me. I don't think an incumbent party should block on social media a citizen that it's meant to represent. But what do I know about democracy? Democracy in Taiwan nowadays simply means you kowtow to the DPP. Now, I want to give a huge shout out to my upper level patrons and YouTube channel members: Alvin Jia, Wang Yijing, Michael Kim, Victor, CD14039, Jim Fox, Cabasa de Fogo, and SCY. If you like what I'm doing and want to help me continue giving perspectives on Taiwan, mainland China, cross-strait relations, and more that are not typically covered by Western mainstream media, please consider subscribing to my show if you haven't done so already on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. If you really want to help me grow and have the means, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon, becoming a channel member on YouTube, or making a one-time donation to any of the links in the show notes. As always, if you got any questions, topic suggestions, or anything of that nature, please feel free to shoot me an email at straighttalk@xiangyu.tw. That's all I got for today. See you guys in the next episode.